When people think of the Second World War and they think of the American military in that conflict, they picture the GI carrying the M1 Garand Rifle. The M1 service rifle was, of course, prolific in the Second World War, but it wasn't the only rifle that we were using. In fact, the Marine Corps would fight over 2 years of the war in the Pacific before they adopted the M1 Garand. It was during that time that the U.S. Marine Corps was fighting the war against the Japanese with a manually operated 5-shot bolt-action rifle, the M1903 rifle.
The famed Model 1903 Springfield Rifle replaced its predecessor, the Krag. The Krag rifle had been adopted in 1892, was a Scandinavian design, but unfortunately it would neither take cartridges from a stripper clip, they had to be loaded in singly, and also it could not withstand the high breech pressures of modern high-velocity cartridges. So the U.S. government looked at the Mauser rifles that had been captured during the Spanish-American War and pretty well copied the Mauser design.
In 1939, the principal arm of the United States Army was still the U.S. model of 1903 Springfield bolt-action rifle. When you look at American outposts throughout the world, in particular in the Pacific, they are armed with the U.S. model 1903 Springfield rifle. And indeed, in 1941, December 1941, the majority of American troops were still armed with Springfield rifles.
It's during the battle on Guadalcanal that Marines armed with the 1903 deliver one of the greatest victories that we experienced in the early part of the war. But the 1903 rifle is not the only manually operated bolt-action rifle that the United States military uses during the Second World War. The U.S. military ultimately uses a number of manually operated bolt-action rifles during the Second World War. And in a surprising way, and in surprising numbers, and surprisingly late in the conflict as well. It's well known how Marines used the M1903 rifle in early battles in the Pacific, but it's probably less well known, and certainly not as recognized, that the United States Army issued a very large number of 5-shot manually operated bolt-action rifles throughout the Second World War. When we think of D-Day, when we think of June 6, 1944, we think of Americans storming ashore at Omaha Beach and Utah Beach carrying their M1 Garand rifles. But the photography from D-Day and from the months that follow reveals a surprising number of bolt-action rifles being used by U.S. Army soldiers. In fact, one of the most famous images from D-Day shows a company of soldiers from the 2nd Infantry Division coming ashore at the Ruquette River Valley in the Easy Red sector of Omaha Beach. They're coming ashore on June 7th, the day after D-Day. And every one of them, as they're filing up the bluff, they're armed with the 1903 rifle. So the M1903 rifle is not just a rifle that fought in the hands of U.S. Marines in the Solomon Islands in the Pacific during 1942. It's also a rifle that was issued to U.S. Army soldiers that were about to storm ashore in the invasion of Normandy, France during the summer of '44. That rifle is still around in the months that followed, and some of the photography reveals that regular old 1903 service rifles were still being issued and still being carried into combat by troops as late as December 1944.
The United States Ordnance Department knew it didn't have enough rifles, was concerned about the production of the Garand rifle early in the war, and so they let contracts out for additional models of improved 1903 Springfields. They started a contract with Remington even before we entered the war to produce 1903 Springfields on the old Rock Island Armory tooling. Remington got going on these rifles and deliveries were coming. Then Remington design engineers came to the Ordnance Department and said, you know, we can do things differently. We can speed production by changing some things out. The trigger guard, the magazine floor plate, we can use stampings to make these parts. They looked at the rear sight, which was the original 03 Springfield sight is a thing of manufacturing brilliance. They considered enough differences between the 1903 Springfield, the A1, and then this new improved, easier to manufacture rifle that they designated the gun, the model 1903A3.
Now, the 03A3s were used mainly by rifle grenadiers, but were used by some rear echelon forces such as military police, Navy Shore Patrol used them. When the first Brazilian regiment went into Italy, they were armed with 03A3s.
And so during World War II, this simplified version, the M1903A3 rifle, was produced at Remington, Winchester, and distributed all across the globe. It becomes one of the more prolific of the standardized infantry rifles that are being used by the American military in World War II.
As the U.S. military customarily is, the need for sniping rifles was neglected. There were very few sniping rifles left over from the Great War, and these guns tended to have the Warner and Swayze prismatic sight, which is this huge boxy thing that mounted to the side of an 03 Springfield, and it wasn't very good. So the United States Army Ordnance Department looked at taking off-the-shelf components and creating a bolt-action sniping rifle. The end result was the U.S. model of 1903A4.
With Remington 03A3 rifles as kind of the starting place, they take off the rear sight, they take off the front sight post, and they attach the Weaver 330 scope to the rifle. And ultimately it is adopted and designated the M1903A4 sniper rifle. But just like all the other 03s, it fires the M230 caliber cartridge, what we call 30-06 sometimes. It fires from a 5-shot internal magazine, and it becomes the sniper rifle that the United States Army uses throughout the war.
The 03 Springfield, as far as I'm concerned, is probably the best bolt-action military rifle ever made. And they were accurate, they were reliable, they could not be loaded with stripper clips, but snipers, seldom need volume of firepower. The 1903A4 saw service in North Africa with the United States Army. There's a very famous photo of a paratrooper, an American Army paratrooper with his 03A4 in North Africa that was used in Sicily. It was used on D-Day. American snipers went ashore and jumped out of C-47s with the 03A4. It was the standard sniping rifle of the American infantrymen during World War II.
When the United States was ultimately drawn into the conflict, it was recognized that there just wasn't enough in the way of rifles. We had adopted the M1 service rifle in 1937, but there wouldn't be a sufficient number to arm the expanding American military. It was also determined very quickly that there wasn't going to be enough 1903 rifles at that stage. The American military needed something that it could turn to in the interim while production was beginning to spool up. And what we had on hand were World War I surplus M1917 rifles, and we had millions of them on hand. We call the M1917 rifle the infield rifle sometimes because of the fact that the weapon was being made in the United States as the P14 rifle, being made for the British government in .303 caliber. Once the United States had entered the First World War, it was obvious that the machining and all of the tooling and the manufacturing staff that was producing the British P14 and .303, that it could be easily changed over to .30 caliber and the weapon could be produced for the American military. So when you think of the United States military in the Second World War, don't just think of the M1 Garand Rifle. Think also of the 1903, the 1903A3, the 1903A4, the Marine Corps and its use of the M1903A1, and don't forget the old Remington and Smith Corona M1917 rifles. These are rifles that are part of World War II because the United States had to produce the industrial base to support a 16 million man citizen soldier army. And so a lot of people went into combat in World War II with 5-shot, manually operated bolt-action rifles that had been around for 4 decades.